apologize for coming to the rostrum once again. But I must quickly tell you about my hesitation in doing the review. I have dealt, as I said in my opening remarks, with this whole subject through at least 10 years, because I was in Washington at the embassy, and then I was at the Foreign Office later. So I just wanted to do a very comfortable thing of delivering some opening remarks, welcoming remarks, and then let the ball roll. But I was told by my colleague that Dr. Rabia has insisted that I should be also reviewing the book. So, I was left with no choice. I didn't want to disappoint you. So, here I am. And now I'll go through the write-up that I have done. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Rabia Akhtar's book, Blind Eye, U.S. Non-proliferation policy towards Pakistan from port to fleet, is a welcome addition to the literature which projects Pakistan's perspective on the nuclear issue. Tracing the history of Pakistan-U.S. engagement on nuclear matters in a time span of more than 2 decades, not done before, the book stakes out a new path of research and study. We have heard 2 excellent reviews of the book by 2 eminent scholars, Dr. David Holloway and Dr. Rifat Hussain, who have ably analyzed the contents of the book. My examination of Blind Eye will be more of a commentary on the subject matter of the book, rather than a review in the standard manner, and for 2 good reasons. Rather than review the book, I thought that I will give you a first-hand experience of Pakistan-US nuclear interaction during much of the time span covered in the book, in my assignments in Washington and Islamabad, and thus contribute to a discussion of the book for the material that has so meticulously been put together. I first make the point that Pakistan started out on the nuclear path in pursuance of a quest for nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. And this is well documented. One of the first 3 developing countries to avail of the opportunities offered by the Atoms for Peace program in 1953. The other 2 being Turkey and Israel. And please note that India was not in this group of 3. Pakistan embarked upon an extensive program of sending its promising students to Western universities for graduate and postgraduate studies in nuclear physics and nuclear technology. This gave it the dividend of having a whole crop of nuclear scientists and engineers by 1957-58 to run its peaceful uses program in agriculture, medicine, power, and R&D. And that was when the Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission was established in the year 1957. Thus, by the beginning of the 70s, a little over a decade later, Pakistan was well poised to embark upon a military program which could enable it to acquire a weapons development capability. The Indian nuclear tests in 1974, the so-called peaceful nuclear explosion, PNE, was the trigger that led Pakistan down this road. After all, it had recently undergone a war experience with India in 1971. The other motivating factor, and that's not often brought out in my view, was curiously enough the drafting and entry into force of the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, in 1968. Pakistani diplomats at the UN had played a very active role in the drafting of the NPT and had hoped for a treaty which would be fair and equitable. Long drawn out debates over many months on the language of Article 6 of the NPT finally ended in a formulation which did not bind the nuclear weapon states to disarm. This was disappointing. Our team, led by Mr. Agha Shahi, was personally disappointed by the failure of the international community to draft legislation which would be fair, which would bind the nuclear weapon states to a commitment regarding disarmament. So, in my view, and I may not be, I may not be right. In my view, this factor, along with the Indian PNE, combined to motivate Pakistan to set out on its own, leading to the development of its own weapons program. It was around this time that the US Congress enacted the 7th Amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961. In the pursuit of its non-proliferation mandate, successive US administrations remained engaged with Pakistan on the nuclear issue. The Symington Amendment was followed by the Glenn, the Pressler, and later the Solar's amendments, which made the engagement progressively more onerous. Rabia's book covers US non-proliferation policies during the 5 consecutive administrations from 38th US President Gerald Ford to the 42nd US President Bill Clinton. The time period covered in this book, from 1974 to 2001, is crucial for understanding the history and the necessity of Pakistan's nuclear weapon for ensuring its security. In Pak-US relations, of course, rapidly changing regional and strategic dynamics played a significant part. Now, this swiftly changing strategic dynamics and dissimilarity in national security objectives of both countries have been, unfortunately, the factor that has undermined a stable long-term strategic alliance between Pakistan and the United States. The Blind Eye has 6 chapters, apart from the introduction, which discusses the 5 administrations and ends with a comprehensive conclusion. While introducing Pak-US relations, the author gives a brief history which shows the trust deficit developing between the two countries. She highlights long trend of mutually negative misperceptions. 3 significant questions are raised by the author to examine the US non-proliferation policy towards Pakistan. First, was the US non-proliferation policy a case of selective enforcement of US non-proliferation laws? Second, what did Pakistan get out of the alliance during the period of engagement when it was developing its own nuclear weapons? And finally, how did Pakistan manage to acquire the bomb at the height of its criticism of US non-proliferation policy and its engagement with the United States? These questions are answered very adequately in the book. And then I go on to describe the chapter. Chapter 1 describes the critical period when Pakistani leadership was building its understanding on consensus for having its own nuclear weapons program after India detonated its first device in 1974, which I have talked about. It describes in detail the Symington Amendment, Pakistan's efforts following the US concerns about Pakistan's interest in acquiring plutonium reprocessing plant from France. In Chapter 2, Carter administration's non-proliferation policy towards Pakistan, the author says that both the military coup by General Ehsan-Ul-Haq and the policies of the Carter administration on non-proliferation combined to worsen the relations between the US and Pakistan. The Glenn Amendment in 1977 and Symington in 1970, I think the declared in 77, Southampton earlier in 76, along with the cancellation of Pakistan-France reprocessing plant agreement in 1978, put a lot of pressure on Pakistan. But the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 came as a blessing in disguise for us. As Pakistan and the US became partners in the fight against Soviet expansion, the Carter administration softened the provisions of the Symington Amendment in implementation. Relations between Pakistan and the US under Reagan administration were much easier than that of the previous administrations. Pakistan continued to work on its clandestine nuclear program. At this point, the Pressler and Solar's amendments did apparently restrict Pakistan's efforts during the two Reagan administrations. Chapter 3, Reagan administration's non-proliferation policy towards Pakistan, deliberates on Pakistan's efforts to assist the US in the Cold War with non-proliferation trade-offs made in return by the US. Chapter 4 has a detailed discussion on H.W. Bush administration's non-proliferation policy towards Pakistan. The author says that this period witnessed the most damaging sanctions under the Pressler Amendment at the end, and Pakistan felt completely betrayed by the US. Along with discussing the Pressler Amendment and its implications for Pakistan, the author also discusses how the Bush administration attempted to find ways to bypass the Pressler Amendment to accommodate Pakistan. Chapter 5, Clinton administration's non-proliferation policy towards Pakistan, discusses the less acknowledged Brown and Harkin-Warner amendments, which allowed Pakistan to get fully paid military supplies from the US that were held up after the Pressler Amendment provisions were applied. On the other hand, the author recognizes Clinton's efforts to stop both Pakistan and India from conducting nuclear tests in 1998 and to engage them on the issue of comprehensive test ban. In this chapter, the author examines the enactment of the Brown Amendment, which resulted in the release of defense equipment for Pakistan, the resolution of the embargoed F-16s for Pakistan, and US nuclear diplomacy during the Indo-Pak Kargil crisis in 1999. I landed up in Washington in July 1991 when we were bearing the full brunt of the Pressler Amendment restrictions. When I left Washington in 1995 to take up my responsibilities as ambassador in Jordan, the Brown Amendment had been adopted, followed later by the Harkin-Warner amendments. So, you see, from a low point where the Pressler Amendment was hard and harsh for Pakistan, by the time in that 5-year period, we had managed to persuade the Clinton administration to soften the terms, and Senator Brown was very kind to Pakistan. So the Brown Amendment was adopted in 1995. A lot of diplomatic effort went into the enactment of the Brown Amendment. The US mantra at that time, by the way, was quote unquote rollback. This was told to us. In my meetings on the Hill, used to be told that, your only salvation lies in a rollback. Go back, forget about what you've been doing. We succeeded in turning this around to a graded or gradual acceptance of our stance by the US establishment. I took on Senator Glenn in the Washington Post in 1992 and wrote an op-ed piece to justify our position. The title of my op-ed piece, this was not a letter to the editor, and Washington Post did not publish as a rule op-ed articles by diplomats posted in Washington, but they made an exception for me because the case that I had made was very strong. And the title of that article was "Don't Blame Pakistan." Some years later, when I returned to Islamabad, I was again assigned the handling of Pakistan-US relations, this time as Additional Foreign Secretary Americas in the Foreign Office, and had to deal with the final settlement of the F-16s issue. Though we got a bad deal on the return of our payments for the aircraft we had ordered and were denied the planes that were sitting on the tarmac but not being given to us. Therefore, we thought that it was a bad situation and we accepted the settlement as it came in some money and some commodities assistance, as we thought it was unlikely in the present environment in Washington to get anything more than what was being offered. Anyway, these are thoughts that came to me as I was looking at the book. The last chapter, conclusion of the book, gives an overview of the US non-proliferation policies towards Pakistan. And there are a few things that are worth mentioning from the conclusion of this book. The author writes that Pakistan's quest for nuclear weapons affected the relationship with the United States, since Pakistan was challenging the global non-proliferation norms championed by the US. This argument is right, and the reason is that the US failed, in our case, to give us security assurances when we sought it in crisis or in war with India in 1965 and in 1971. For assuring our national security and preserving the strategic stability of the South Asia region, Pakistan had to develop its own nuclear weapons. Dr. Rabia rightly highlighted the fact that the systematic historical examination of the US non-proliferation policies towards Pakistan, using archival data from presidential and congressional archives, reveals a peculiar pattern, which shows that although the non-proliferation policy by which each administration was designed, was designed to create an imbalance which would prevent Pakistan from going nuclear. But ironically, it ended up achieving just the opposite. Interestingly, she also highlights a pattern of scrimmage between the US Congress and the executive being not on the same page while underlining non-proliferation policies towards Pakistan. And I can vouch for it because I experienced it myself, but I won't go into that not to prolong this. The book argues that the US failure to prevent Pakistan from achieving and testing its nuclear weapons capability was, as has already been said, not a policy failure but an enforcement failure. And it pushed Pakistan to choose between aid and the bomb. So, each administration in its own turn prioritized foreign policy over non-proliferation. Therefore, I think the book is an effective critique on the US non-proliferation policies and its conclusion that Pakistan's popular narrative needs a reset with respect to the objectives and successes of US non-proliferation policies towards Pakistan, I think is well merited. The author very impressively establishes that it was first the biased non-proliferation policies of the US which gave Pakistan this space to develop on its own nuclear weapons program. And while the US gave Pakistan the choices, it itself opted, in fact, for foreign policy goals over non-proliferation. An important takeaway from the book, I thought, is that Pakistan's commitment and political will of civilian governments from Bhutto to Sharif remain completely firm on the cause, which I have said just now in the remarks also. But this point is very important, and it shows that Pakistan remained determined to achieve what it wanted to do. And finally, I think that the book is important because it is based on primary source archival data of the US, including presidential documents and archival of the Senate. This is what gives authenticity to this scholarly work. Second, it is the first scholarly account of the US non-proliferation policies towards Pakistan as a case study where those policies are applied to a particular country, a friend and an ally, and how they turn out. What do they achieve, what do they not achieve. So, it is full kudos, full credit to Dr. Rabia Akhtar for an impressive research book, and I think we all feel proud of the fact that she has done it. Thank you.